Before the beaches of Normandy were covered in landing craft, before Allied armies could even dream of retaking Europe, there was a problem that no general could solve. How do you land tanks, men, and supplies on a defended shore when you don't own a port? For years, the world's great navies had no answer. But a blunt, stubborn boat builder from the Louisiana swamps did. His name was Andrew Jackson Higgins, and his invention would turn the tide of war. Higgins was born in Nebraska in 1886, far from any ocean. He grew up working the land, the son of a farmer who taught him that when a tool breaks, you don't complain, you fix it. That lesson stayed with him. After a short stint in the National Guard and some time in shipping, he drifted south to New Orleans, drawn by opportunity and by the strange, tangled waterways of the Gulf Coast. There he built a small lumber company, cutting cypress from the swamps. To move the logs, he needed shallow draft boats that could skim over mud and reeds where propellers would snag. So he started designing his own. His early craft, called Eureka boats, had flat bottoms and a unique recessed propeller guard that let them run right up onto shore, then back off again without damage. They were ugly, fast, and nearly impossible to strand. Local trappers, oilmen, and loggers loved them. By the late 1930s, Higgins had turned his lumber yard into Higgins Industries, a tiny shipbuilding outfit on St. Charles Avenue. He had a dozen employees, a head full of ideas, and a temper that could blister paint. Then, the world began to slide toward war. Japan was expanding in the Pacific. Hitler was swallowing Europe. The U.S. military realized that any future conflict would require landing troops on enemy beaches, but none of its vessels could do it. Traditional ships drew too much water. Small boats flipped in the surf. In war games, generals simply pretended ports existed where they didn't. It was an unsolved riddle. Higgins thought he had the answer sitting in his back lot. His Eureka boat could run right up onto land. He wrote to the Marine Corps offering a demonstration. They ignored him, so he invited them anyway. In 1938, on the muddy shores of Lake Pontchartrain, a handful of Marines watched as Higgins himself took the wheel of one of his boats. He opened the throttle, raced full speed toward the bank, hit the mud, and without hesitation reversed off again. The officers blinked. No one had seen anything like it. But they noticed a flaw. To unload men, troops had to climb over the gunwales and drop into the water. That slowed them down and exposed them to fire. Back in New Orleans, Higgins listened to their complaints and started sketching. He cut a hole in the bow and fitted it with a folding steel ramp, operated by cables and a hand winch. When lowered, it created a smooth path straight onto land. He didn't invent the ramp. Japanese landing craft already used one, but he perfected it for mass production, adapting it to his shallow draft hull. The new model was designated the LCVP, Landing Craft, Vehicle, Personnel. The Navy wasn't convinced. Most senior officers came from battleship backgrounds. Wooden boats seemed trivial to them. But the Marines were enthusiastic. They placed a small test order, and Higgins' tiny yard began building. He hired carpenters, electricians, and welders from around New Orleans. They worked out of sheds, using hand tools, learning by doing. The first prototypes arrived at Quantico for testing in 1941. The Marines drove jeeps directly off the ramps and onto the sand. They knew instantly this was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. Still, bureaucracy moved slowly. The Navy preferred to design its own version. Higgins fumed. He accused Washington of stalling while the world burned. His letters were fiery, his phone calls even more so. But events overseas would soon settle the argument. On December 7, 1941, Japan struck. Overnight, the United States was at war, and suddenly the Navy needed every landing craft it could get. They turned to the only man who had a working design ready to go, Andrew Higgins.
Within weeks, orders poured in, hundreds, then thousands. Higgins' small workshop could barely hold 50 men. He leased every warehouse and pier he could find. By early 1942, he was operating multiple plants along the Industrial Canal. Lumber arrived by train, engines by barge. New Orleans transformed into a humming network of shipyards. Workers came from every background: black, white, male, female. Higgins ignored segregation laws inside his factories, saying only, "If you can build boats, you're hired." For many women and minorities, it was the first time they earned equal pay for equal work. In less than a year, his workforce grew from a few dozen to more than 20,000. The Navy doubted he could meet demand. He proved them wrong month after month. Each boat took less than 2 days to assemble. By mid-1943, one slid into the water every 20 minutes. Higgins' management style was direct. He stalked the factory floors in shirt sleeves, cigar clamped in his teeth, barking orders and cracking jokes. He knew his employees by name. When something went wrong, he fixed it himself and expected everyone else to do the same. To him, delay was the real enemy. He built his own supply chains, his own sawmills, his own machine shops, even his own testing tank. If the Navy couldn't deliver parts, Higgins Industries made them. He was turning a swamp city into one of the most productive shipyards on Earth. By 1943, the Allies were preparing for their first major landings, Operation Torch in North Africa. Hundreds of Higgins boats carried American troops onto the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. It was the first real test. Reports came back glowing. The boats survived surf, coral, and gunfire. Commanders cabled New Orleans, more boats, fast. Next came Sicily and Italy. Each landing proved the same point. The flat-bottomed, ramp-fronted craft could deliver men and vehicles exactly where needed. They were easy to repair, simple to steer, and light enough to stack by the dozen on transport ships. They turned amphibious warfare from theory to practice. Higgins' reputation soared. The once dismissed boat builder was now a national figure. Reporters dubbed him the man who won the war before it started. President Roosevelt toured his plants and told aides, "This Higgins is worth more than all the generals combined." It wasn't an exaggeration. Without his boats, there was no way to land on Europe's shores. In England, preparations for the largest amphibious invasion in history were underway. Operation Overlord, D-Day. The planners needed over 20,000 landing craft. Most would be Higgins' design. From 1942 to 1944, his factories produced more than 20,000 LCVPs, plus thousands of larger LCMs for tanks and cargo. They poured out of New Orleans, loaded onto transports, and shipped to every theater of war. By spring 1944, his boats filled British harbors like schools of fish. Each was a wooden symbol of American ingenuity, 36 feet long, powered by a diesel engine, carrying 36 soldiers and their hopes ashore. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the ramps dropped on the beaches of Normandy. German guns opened fire. Bullets tore through surf and steel. But the boats kept coming, thousands of them in perfect formation. Higgins' design allowed them to beach on sand, unload troops and jeeps, and back off again in seconds. Historians later estimated that of all Allied troops who landed that day, over 90% arrived in a Higgins boat. General Eisenhower said afterwards, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those landing craft, we never could have landed over an open beach." When the war ended, the factories went quiet. Contracts were canceled, workers laid off. Higgins tried to pivot to peacetime production, luxury boats, even airplanes, but the demand vanished. He died in 1952, largely forgotten by the public, though every veteran who ever rode one of his boats remembered his name. Today, replicas of the Higgins boat sit in museums across the world. Their wooden planks bear the scars of salt and battle, but they also carry something else: the proof that innovation can come from anywhere, even from a farmer's son who refused to take no for an answer. Andrew Jackson Higgins never commanded troops or held office, but through sheer will and invention, he gave the Allies the means to storm the gates of tyranny. He built a simple boat, flat, fast, and tough, that carried an army across the sea and helped end a war. In every sense, the farmer from Nebraska truly outsmarted Hitler's Navy.